There's a moment, and most people miss it. It doesn't come with shouting. It doesn't come with drama. It doesn't even come with a warning. It comes in silence. And if you've ever had an empath in your life, and you push them too far, that silence is the last thing you'll ever hear from them. Because when an empath is done, they don't fight. They don't beg. They don't try to prove their worth one more time. They disappear. Not out of weakness, but out of realization. You see, empaths are not naive the way people think. They see everything. They feel everything. Every shift in your tone, every inconsistency in your words, every moment where your actions didn't match your promises. They knew, long before you thought they knew, but they stayed. They stayed because they believed in potential. They stayed because they saw the good in you that you couldn't even see in yourself. They stayed because they thought love, patience, understanding could change something. And that's where most people make the biggest mistake. They mistake patience for tolerance. They mistake kindness for weakness. They mistake silence for acceptance. But what they don't understand is, every time you crossed a line, every time you dismissed their feelings, every time you made them feel small, something inside them was quietly shutting down. Most people think an empath leaves in a single moment, like a switch flips and suddenly they're gone. But that's not how it happens, not even close. What feels sudden to you is something they have been slowly living through for weeks, months, sometimes years. A quiet internal process where something inside them starts changing long before their physical presence ever disappears. And the most dangerous part is, you don't notice it because it doesn't look like conflict. It doesn't look like anger. It doesn't even look like distance at first. It looks like patience. It looks like understanding. It looks like they're still there the way they've always been. But beneath that calm surface, something is shifting, something is closing, something is preparing to let go without ever needing to announce it. An empath doesn't wake up one day and decide to stop caring. They try first. They try harder than most people ever will. They replay conversations in their mind. They analyze your words, your tone, your behavior, searching for meaning, searching for reasons, giving you the benefit of the doubt over and over again, even when the evidence is right in front of them. They tell themselves you didn't mean it that way. They convince themselves you're just going through something. They justify the things that hurt them because they would rather carry the pain themselves than accept that someone they care about is the source of it. And while they're doing all of this, while they're protecting your image in their mind, they're slowly exhausting themselves in a way you cannot see. Because empaths don't always express their breaking point out loud. They internalize it, they absorb it, they sit with it in silence. And every time they choose not to react, every time they choose to stay calm instead of confront you, a piece of their emotional energy gets used up. Not dramatically, not in a way that creates a scene, but in a way that slowly drains them until there's less and less left to give. At first, nothing changes on the outside. They still show up, they still listen, they still care. But something subtle begins to fade. They stop repeating themselves. They stop trying to make you understand the same thing over and over again, because they start realizing that being heard and being ignored feel exactly the same when nothing ever changes. So instead of raising their voice, they lower their expectations. Instead of asking for more, they start needing less. Not because they deserve less, but because they're preparing themselves for the reality that they might not receive what they've been giving all along. Then comes the next shift. And this is the one most people completely miss. They stop reacting the way they used to. The things that once upset them no longer get a response. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because they're tired of showing that it does. They begin to observe instead of engage. They watch instead of respond. And to you, it might look like they're becoming easier, calmer, less emotional. But what's actually happening is they're pulling their emotional investment back piece by piece, protecting what little energy they have left. And this is where the illusion becomes dangerous, because when an empath stops reacting, most people think the problem is gone. They think things have improved. They think whatever tension existed has faded. But in reality, the empath is no longer fighting for the connection. They're no longer trying to fix what's broken. They're simply existing in a space they have already started to outgrow. And the silence that replaces their effort is not peace. It's distance forming in real time. After that, something even deeper changes. They stop expecting you to understand them at all. They no longer look to you for emotional support. They no longer open up the way they used to, because they've learned through repeated experience that vulnerability without reciprocity only leads to more disappointment. So they close that part of themselves off, not to the world, but specifically to you. And that's a line most people never realize has been crossed until it's too late. Now, they're still there physically, still present in conversations, still responding when you reach out. But the emotional connection that once defined your relationship is no longer accessible. It's like talking to someone who remembers everything but feels nothing about it anymore. And that shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, quietly, in moments where they choose silence over explanation, distance over conflict, peace over attachment. And then comes the final stage, the one that feels sudden to everyone except them. They stop caring completely. Not in a cold or cruel way, but in a way that feels calm, almost indifferent. The emotional charge is gone. The attachment is gone. The need to hold on is gone. And when that happens, leaving is no longer painful. It becomes natural. It becomes necessary. It becomes something they do without hesitation, because they've already done the hardest part internally. By the time they actually walk away, they've already processed the loss. They've already accepted the reality. They've already let go in ways you never witnessed. So while you're trying to understand why it feels so sudden, they're already at peace with a decision that took them a long time to reach. And this is why their absence feels so absolute, because it's not driven by impulse, it's not fueled by emotion, it's the result of a long, silent detachment that unfolded right in front of you without ever demanding your attention. And when it's complete, there's nothing left for them to hold on to, nothing left for them to fight for, nothing left that connects them to the version of the relationship you thought still existed. People expect a breaking point to look like anger, to sound like raised voices and slam doors, to feel explosive and undeniable. But with an empath, it rarely looks like that, because their breaking point is not built on emotion overflowing, it is built on emotion finally becoming clear. And clarity is quiet, steady, and far more dangerous than anger will ever be. An empath can survive anger. They can move through conflict. They can forgive harsh words spoken in moments of frustration, because they understand human imperfection better than most. They can see the wounds behind behavior, the fear behind defensiveness, the pain behind actions that don't make sense. And that ability to see deeper is exactly why they stay longer than they should, exactly why they keep giving chances when others would have already walked away, because they don't just see what you did, they see why you did it. And they convince themselves that understanding you is enough reason to keep holding on. But understanding is not the same as being treated right. And this is the truth that takes them the longest to fully accept, because for so long they believe that if they can just love better, communicate better, be more patient, more supportive, more everything, then something will shift, something will click, something will finally be different. So they keep adjusting themselves, reshaping their expectations, lowering their needs, trying to meet you in a place where they hope you will eventually meet them too. And while they're doing all of this, while they're investing more and more of themselves into something that keeps taking without giving, a quiet awareness starts forming in the background, not loud enough to demand immediate action, but persistent enough that it cannot be ignored forever. It shows up in small moments, in the way certain patterns repeat, in the way apologies don't lead to change, in the way promises sound sincere but never materialize into action. And each time this awareness surfaces, they push it down. They silence it with hope. They override it with empathy, because facing it would mean admitting something they are not ready to admit yet. That what they are giving is not being valued the way it should be. That what they are tolerating is not something they deserve. That what they are holding on to is slowly draining them. And so they continue, not because they don't see the truth, but because they are not ready to accept what the truth requires them to do. But clarity doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It builds. It strengthens. It gathers evidence. And over time, it becomes harder and harder to justify the same patterns, harder to excuse the same behavior, harder to believe in the same potential that never seems to become reality, until one day, something shifts. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but mentally. A line gets drawn in a place that had no boundaries before, and suddenly the question changes. It is no longer, how can I fix this? It becomes, why am I the only one trying? It is no longer, what are they going through? It becomes, what am I going through by staying? It is no longer, how do I understand them better? It becomes, Why am I not being understood at all? And that shift, that internal change in perspective, is the beginning of the end. Because once an empath starts asking those questions, they are no longer operating from pure emotion, they are operating from awareness. And awareness does something that emotion cannot do. It removes illusion. It strips away the stories they told themselves to keep the connection alive. It exposes the difference between intention and reality. It forces them to see not who you could be, but who you consistently are. And when that happens, something inside them stabilizes in a way that is almost unsettling, because they are no longer confused. They are no longer hoping for change without evidence. They are no longer waiting for a version of you that has never truly existed in action. And that calm certainty replaces the emotional chaos they once felt. This is why their breaking point doesn't look like anger, because anger comes from still caring enough to fight, still believing there is something left to save. But clarity comes from realizing there is nothing left to fix, nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to explain. And when you reach that point, you don't argue, you don't chase, you don't try to be heard one last time, you simply step back and accept what is. And acceptance is what makes it final, because an empath who is still emotional can be pulled back. They can be convinced, they can be reached through apologies, through promises, through moments of temporary change. But an empath who has reached clarity cannot be manipulated by words anymore, because they are no longer listening to what you say, they are observing what you do. And when those two things don't match, your words lose all weight. They begin to trust patterns more than potential, consistency more than promises, reality more than hope. And once that shift happens, there is nothing you can say that will recreate the version of them that once believed in you without hesitation. Because that version of them existed in a space where clarity had not yet fully formed. And now that it has, they cannot unsee what they see. They cannot unknow what they know. They cannot go back to interpreting the same actions in a more forgiving way when they have already recognized the truth behind them. And this is the part that feels cold to the person on the other side, because it seems like the empath suddenly stopped caring, suddenly became distant, suddenly changed without warning. But the reality is, they didn't change suddenly. They arrived at a conclusion slowly, and once they reached it, there was no reason left to stay the same. Their energy shifts, their presence feels different. Not because they are trying to punish you, but because they are no longer emotionally invested in the same way. The attachment that once made them overlook everything is gone, replaced by a grounded awareness that protects them from repeating the same cycle again. And when an empath reaches that level of clarity, they don't need closure from you. They don't need a final conversation. They don't need you to finally understand what you never understood before, because they have already given themselves the closure they were once hoping to receive from you. They see the pattern, they accept the reality, and they choose themselves, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of a quiet, undeniable truth that they can no longer ignore. A truth that doesn't demand reaction, doesn't create chaos, doesn't seek validation. A truth that simply says, this is not where I belong anymore. When an empath finally chooses themselves, most people think it's just a phase, a reaction, something temporary that will fade with time. But that assumption is exactly why so many people lose them permanently. Because what looks like distance on the surface is actually a complete internal shift, a transformation in identity, a moment where they stop negotiating with their own worth and start standing on it without compromise. This is not the kind of decision that happens lightly. It is not impulsive. It is not emotional in the way people expect. It is built on everything they have experienced, everything they have tolerated, everything they have quietly processed while still showing up with love when it wasn't being returned in the same way. And when all of that finally reaches a point where it can no longer be justified, something inside them locks into place with a level of certainty that does not waver. Because for the first time, they are not asking what you need. They are asking what they need. And that question changes the direction of everything. For so long, they were willing to bend, to adjust, to give more than they received because they believed that love meant endurance, that loyalty meant staying even when it hurt, that understanding someone else was more important than being understood. But when they choose themselves, those beliefs are replaced with something stronger, something unshakable, something that no longer allows them to abandon themselves in order to keep someone else comfortable. And once that line is drawn, it is not something they cross back over, because they remember what it felt like to ignore their own needs, to silence their own voice, to stay in situations that slowly drained them while convincing themselves it was worth it. And that memory becomes a boundary in itself, a reminder that they will not return to a version of their life where their peace was constantly compromised. This is why their decision feels so final, because it is not based on how they feel in a single moment. It is based on what they have learned over time, and lessons learned through repeated emotional experience do not disappear just because someone apologizes or promises to change. You can say the right words. You can try to explain yourself in ways you never did before. You can suddenly show effort that was missing for so long. But none of that reaches them the same way anymore, because they are no longer looking for potential. They are looking at patterns. And patterns have already told them everything they need to know. When an empath chooses themselves, they stop responding to possibility and start responding to reality. They stop hoping that things will be different and start accepting that things have been exactly what they are for a reason. They stop waiting for the version of you they imagined and start seeing the version of you that consistently showed up. And that shift removes the emotional hooks that once kept them attached. It removes the desire to hold on. It removes the instinct to fix. It removes the need to stay. And without those things, there is nothing left tying them to the connection. What makes this even more difficult to understand from the outside is how calm they become, because people expect a big reaction when someone is about to leave for good. They expect tears, anger, long conversations filled with emotion. But when an empath has truly chosen themselves, there is a quietness to them that feels almost unsettling, a stillness that comes from knowing they are no longer conflicted. They are not trying to decide anymore. They are not going back and forth in their mind. They are not questioning whether they should stay or go. They have already made that decision internally, and once that happens, their actions simply follow. They begin to detach in a way that is not reactive, but intentional. They create space without needing to explain it. They step back without asking for permission. They move forward without looking for reassurance. And the person on the other side often mistakes this calmness for something temporary, something that can be reversed if they just try hard enough, if they just say the right thing, if they just show up differently now. But what they fail to realize is that the empath is no longer in a place where they are waiting to be convinced. They are in a place where they have already accepted what is. And acceptance is what makes their decision permanent. Because once you accept something fully, you stop resisting it. You stop trying to change it. You stop investing energy into something that has already shown you its limits. You redirect that energy back into yourself, into your own growth, your own peace, your own healing. And that redirection is what creates a version of them that cannot return to who they used to be. Not because they are holding a grudge, not because they want to prove a point, but because they have evolved beyond the place where they once tolerated less than they deserved. And evolution does not move backward. It moves forward, even when it's difficult, even when it means letting go of people they once cared deeply about, even when it means walking away from something that once felt like everything. They understand that staying would cost them more than leaving ever could. They understand that peace is not something you find in another person. It is something you protect within yourself. They understand that self-respect is not negotiable, not even for love. And once those truths become part of who they are, there is no version of reality where they go back to abandoning themselves just to maintain a connection. This is why when an empath leaves after choosing themselves, it feels like they are gone in a way that cannot be reached. Because they are not just physically absent, they are emotionally unavailable to the dynamic that once existed. The door is not slightly open, it is closed with a level of certainty that does not invite reconsideration. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how much circumstances change, no matter how much you wish you had understood this sooner, the version of them that stayed, that tolerated, that kept giving without limits, does not exist anymore. What exists now is someone who knows their value, someone who understands their boundaries, someone who has learned from every moment that led them to this decision. And that person is not willing to trade their peace for familiarity, not willing to sacrifice their growth for comfort, not willing to return to a place that required them to be less than who they are. And that is why when they choose themselves, it is not just a decision. It is a point of no return.